I'm Dr. Georgiana Stanchu, and happy to welcome you to the 8th episode of the RCRM Speaker Series Season 2. Those of you who follow since January may remember that this year's theme is an economy of loss. The past episodes have explored various aspects of loss in the context of military conflict. Today's talk is focused on the transition from burying the fallen in graves near the site where they fell to the repatriation of bodies, by comparison, a relatively recent practice that has seen ramp ceremonies on the tarmac attended by family members and senior military or government officials. As our guest, Dr. Tanya Grodzinsky, will explain after reviewing the funeral procedures in the Canadian military since 1800s, this transition was made possible by changes in the policies related to the way the Canadian Armed Forces manage casualties. Dr. Grodzinsky is an Emerita Associate Professor in the History Department at the Royal Military College in Kingston, Ontario. She is also a 36-year veteran of the Canadian Armed Forces, 16 of which were spent as military faculty at RMC, teaching history at the undergraduate and the graduate levels. With an international reputation for her knowledge of the Anglo-American War of 1812, she has researched extensively other Canadian topics, including 80 battlefield studies dealing with colonial North American conflicts and in Italy during the Second World War. Most recently, Dr. Grodzinsky has been preparing a volume covering the history of the Royal Canadian Regiment between 1946 and 2001. Today, we have the opportunity to listen to her research about how the Canadian Armed Forces are commemorating the dead in war and peace. Without further ado, let's listen to Dr. Grodzinsky.
Hello, my name is Tanya Grodzinsky. I'm an Emerita Professor of History at the Royal Military College of Canada. It's my pleasure to share with you an overview of the commemoration of war dead in the Canadian military. My presentation is titled Marking Their Place, Commemorating the Dead in War and Peace from Pre-Confederation Canada to about 2014. We'll go a little bit beyond that. This is certainly not meant to be a comprehensive overview of this topic, but just an introduction to the major themes, and at the end I'll be sharing with you some resources that may be of use. As well, we'll be taking a look principally at overseas conflicts that Canada was involved in, and how the losses that occurred on the battlefield were dealt with. We'll see an evolutionary process where they're buried in theater until later in the 20th century when they're brought back home, repatriated back to Canada. So although we'll be touching upon some conflicts that occurred in North America or on Canadian soil, the emphasis will be on the results of overseas actions. Now, the entire process of how war dead are commemorated is an evolutionary one. It was initially practical, but it was more driven afterwards by emotional matters, the concerns of families and loved ones, as well as broader societal interest in what happens to those who were defending them that were lost on the battlefield. So operational deaths could occur on the battlefield directly, through enemy action, but also as a result of being wounded and disease. Disease played a major factor in casualties in war right until the 20th century. There's also an evolving perspective about death and the need to inter remains as well that we'll be seeing as part of this evolutionary process. But initially, one of the major concerns was to stop the spread of disease. So often, very shortly after somebody died, they were buried. But that also means that sometimes we don't have entire bodies. There are parts of bodies as well that are collected and placed in the ground and remembered. As well, there's the evolving perspective of the soldier and commemorating individual soldiers. Officers often had a marker either in where they passed, or back home, somebody would erect something to commemorate that individual. But it was really growing public attention, concern, and pressure, either directly on the government or through organizations that led to the development of these processes that we'll be taking a look. So what we see is initially there's hasty burial. Sometimes the graves are marked, sometimes they're not. And more often than not, it's unknown who's buried in a particular area, other than maybe soldiers from a particular side. There's also the question of there not being any remains. Sometimes a body was completely destroyed and there was nothing left to bury. As well, the Navy had different procedures. We're familiar with the burial at sea. I'll be touching upon that, but most of my discussion will focus on land forces. So if we look at the pre-Confederation era, the conflicts that occurred in what became Canada, or the wider element of North America, what we find is this process of mass graves was applied. Much as in Europe, following a battle, the remains of soldiers were collected and put in mass graves. Imagine a trench being dug and the bodies laid in there and then quickly covered with earth. There may or may not be some form of memorial service. More often than not, armies continued with their operations, so there was very little time for this. Those individual graves that exist were largely for officers because they had the money to ensure that something was prepared for them. As well, their colleagues, that is other officers, often took steps to make sure that they were memorialized. But if we look at the 7 Years' War from 1756 to 1763, or the Anglo-American War of 1812 from 1812 to 1815, we find this process continues. So whether we're talking about the Hôpital Général de Québec, the cemetery at Quebec City, which has about 1,000 war dead buried there from the Battle of Quebec in 1759, or St. Foy of 1760. These are largely communal graves with the remains of the individuals that are there. Similarly, in the War of 1812, the memorial on Lundy's Lane battlefield, or at the Fort Erie Memorial, both those actions occurred in the summer of 1814 in the Niagara Peninsula. Many of them, well, both of them are actually marking areas where remains are buried. The Lundy's Lane Battlefield Memorial is in the center of a cemetery, and the crypt beneath the memorial contains the remains of soldiers who had initially been buried there, but whose remains had been uncovered over the years as the sexton dug graves for civilians that were living in the area for their funerals. The Battle of Fort Erie Memorial has remains of soldiers who were killed in the battle there in August 1814. About 1,000 British soldiers were casualties, many of them dead, and what remains were found are beneath the marker. What we also have on Lundy's Lane are the markers for individual officers, such as Lieutenant Colonel Cecil Bishop, who died in the summer of 1813, but who's buried in an individual grave, and the stone on top of the crypt has basically a summary of his life and career. So generally what we find is soldiers are in mass graves, and some officers are remembered in individual graves. And it's really not until the South African War of 1899-1902, sometimes referred to as the Boer War or Anglo-Boer War, that we begin to see this process beginning to change. For Canada, this was really the first overseas service of formed units, such as the Royal Canadian Regiment of Infantry, Lord Strathcona's Horse, several regiments of Canadian Mounted Rifles, and other individuals served in that conflict. Certainly Canadians had been overseas earlier, such as during the Nile expedition of 1884-1885. About 400 Canadians, many of them voyageurs, accompanied that, but they weren't really a formed unit. About 16 individuals on that expedition died, and their remains are buried in a lot of graves that are not known, not marked, so they're lost to history. But about 7,000 Canadians served in South Africa. A large British contingent was there, as well, other imperial troops as well. And the casualties that occurred in that established the policy, or continued the policy, of burying remains in theater, but there was really no official system of doing so. There was no grave registration organization, no burial process. So what we find is graves were selected, usually after an action, the remains collected and buried there. After the conflict, land was appropriated and the remains were collected and put in larger graves. But overall, the burials were poorly conducted, often in shallow graves. And it wasn't until the establishment of these consolidated cemeteries in 1904 and 1905 that we see the beginnings of some process by the military and the government to commemorate its war dead. So there's about 120 sites in South Africa. A War Graves Committee was established after the war to manage them. We see the emergence of volunteer organizations such as the Guild of Loyal Women and others who basically raise funds to maintain these grave sites. But over time, they fall into disrepair. The elements deal with them, animals begin digging up remains and so forth. And eventually the British turn over responsibility of the grave sites to the newly established Union of South Africa. So in those graves there are about the remains of several Canadians, including about 68 members of the Royal Canadian Regiment of Infantry who died in South Africa. But there was really little care made towards those graves. On the centenary of that battle, a small contingent from the regiment went to South Africa and found some of the graves and did minor restoration work. But by and large, it's the South African military and the South African state that continues with the maintenance of those grave sites. And during the war, this idea of the poor quality of the graves, the shallowness of them and so forth, and the need to continue the tempo of military operations meant that often bodies remained on the surface. So as this one Boer commander noted, several hundred men lay unburied at the top of the hill in very hot weather for 2 or 3 days. And this meant that the heat started the body's decomposition and there were threats of disease. And even though an armistice was set with the opposing British commander to collect the remains, the focus on repositioning the armies for the next stage of operations gave precedence over burying the dead. So sometimes after a conflict, remains were still found that had to be buried. And at this time, we begin to see various homages to soldiers occur, such as Thomas Hardy, who wrote this poem about drummer Hodge. Up until this point, the average soldier was largely unnamed, not commemorated. And here we have a poem talking about the Boer War and this drummer named Hodge, who is laid to rest, uncoffined, just as found. And it's poetry like this, newspaper articles, the memories of soldiers coming back that begin to instill the public with some desire to have improvements made to what happens to the remains of soldiers who are killed during conflicts. In Canada, this process was ongoing. As I mentioned, there were already war graves within Canada. And in the 1870s, interests in what is now the Dominion of Canada and its history led, for example, to the search for Tecumseh's grave. He died in 1813, supporting the British cause in the war. So people were looking at War of 1812 burial sites, seeing if they could find them. And towards the end of the 19th century, basically the British government tells the Dominions, Canada, Australia, eventually New Zealand and South Africa, that basically those Dominions are responsible for the maintenance of the graves and their sites. So by 1905, this is further placed in procedures and so forth. So the Dominion of Canada government is responsible for war graves within this country. Internationally, the Geneva Conventions begin to outline what should be done with war dead, particularly that for your opponent. They shouldn't be defaced or anything happen to them. They should be reported and buried. And the various military regulations and guidebooks for operations, such as the field service regulations that appear at the beginning of the 20th century, begin to lay out how these burials are to occur. And that means the Canadian militia is responsible for its own war dead. So we begin to see sites occurring. There's pressure placed on members of parliament to acquire land, the creation of Parks Canada to maintain the sites and so forth. And at the same time, there's a need to collect records. Who was buried? Where were they buried? And so forth. So that means records which were in place in Britain had to be copied and brought to Canada as well. So we see the beginnings of a process occurring. And there's numerous grave sites. I mentioned a few, but for example, the Northwest Resistance of 1885, there were grave sites of Métis, but also Canadian militia and volunteers that occurred there. And the preservation of those grave sites and ensuring that the remains were buried, as with all previous conflicts, largely came up after the fact. The South African War had partly driven this process. Concern over the burial of soldiers in South Africa meant that applied to Canada as well. And for example, the Northwest Mounted Police in 1911 inspected some of the graves in the Northwest and found that they were in poor condition. The stones were replaced and so forth. And the militia, fearing the expenses this might occur, were very happy to have the Northwest Mounted Police take this on. So the question of the almighty dollar has a play with this as well. If we move to 21st century Canada, the entire process of reconciliation with Indigenous communities is also influencing this. The war dead of the Indigenous peoples as well are commemorated. So we find both in cemeteries in the Northwest, and both need proper preservation. But it's really not until the First World War that we see a significant change in this entire process. And that's driven by the fact of the mass casualties that occurred in the First World War. Individual battles of the First World War were really not all that much more costly than, let's say, during the Napoleonic Wars. The difference being was that these battles occurred much more frequently. And what we have is, instead of tens of thousands of casualties, hundreds of thousands of casualties each year. So what happens then is the military has to play a process of catch-up, quickly instill processes to ensure that not only are the remains buried, but they're recorded, who's there, what happened to their effects, and so forth. And we see civilian agencies becoming involved as well to assist with this. So for example, the British Red Cross creates mobile units that go across battlefields after the various actions, collect remains, record who that is, where they're buried, and so forth. A Graves Registration Commission is set up. And by the second year of the war in 1915, the British Expeditionary Force and the Commonwealth forces that are attached to it, such as the Canadian Expeditionary Force, had begun implementing procedures and policies of how to deal with the remains of soldiers on the battlefield. So we have a process where the remains are collected, they're buried. Often that's done by the individual unit. The mates of that soldier want to see their friend properly buried, and the units take that on. The chaplain will often lead the burial service, which is done very quickly. And hopefully there's time as well to mark the grave. And so, for example, the document you see on the left is a record for an officer from the Royal Canadian Regiment who died in a hospital. It indicates his date of death, what hospital he was in, and then where he was buried. And we begin to see organizations and processes within the Army formed that will take care of this. So a Directorate of War Graves to manage and record where the war graves occur. A registration process to mark where they are, who's buried there, and so forth. The selection of grave sites, making sure that they're in a location that potentially won't interfere with operations. The maintenance of cards that have the name and any other particulars relating to the individual who's been buried. The process of burial itself, how that's done, the type of cross or marker that's put on the site. As I said, graves registration, which is an exceptionally important process. And eventually we see an Imperial War Graves Commission created But then there's the process of notifying next of kin. There was nothing in place. Eventually, a system of telegrams occurs, but often it's people going down to the office of the local newspaper and seeing taped on the window lists of casualties from certain actions. So there's a whole bunch of activity that has to occur while the war is being fought in order to ensure that soldiers are properly buried, their remains are marked, but also families back home are notified of their loss. So what we see is, as I mentioned, is a whole series of administrative procedures. I won't go through these all, but the Field Service Regulations is the beginning of this. A particular branch of the staff of the military, the Adjutant General Corps, it becomes responsible for it. And through armies, corps, divisions, brigades, and down to individual units, procedures are put in place for taking care of all these war dead. So casualty return forms, notification of death, reporting of enemy dead, the securing of land, the collection and identification of records for burials, okay, graves registration units, which will do that process. As well, sometimes there's ceasefires affected, so soldiers can go into no man's land to collect remains, but sometimes they remain there for months. There's the removal of insignia, personal effects such as the pay book, the identity disc, the personal effects a soldier might have. Often the military kit was auctioned off to other people within the unit, and the funds from that sale were put together with the other personal effects of the soldier and sent back to the families. And as I said, the entire process for notification of the families has to be developed as well. So this is a very involved process that develops largely through the First World War. So the Field Service Regulations of 1909, which were still in effect during the First World War, mentioned the burying of a soldier, the finding of a body after an action, the need to remove the identity disc. So soldiers had two, one remained with the body, the other was collected for record purposes, the individual's pay book, which had a record of their service and so forth, any other identification they might have, personal papers and so forth, their weapons, their military equipment as well. And if there's no identification with the body, anything that might help with its identification. So orders were given prior to operations of what to do, specifying some of these things, such as this officer, Canadian officer before the Battle of Ypres in 1917, about collecting pay books, personal effects, rings, photos, letters, and so forth. Military equipment such as boots, and this was referred to as salvage. And the personal effects were put into a white bag, which was then sent back to the unit for onward transmission, eventually getting to the families. And as this officer noted, this was a gruesome job. These were people that they knew. Often their bodies were had significant wounds on them, and it was a very emotional, difficult process for them to undertake. In the Canadian Corps, these procedures were adopted. The Canadian Corps was formed in 1915, eventually comprising 4 divisions with 100,000 troops. So all these processes were applied to it based on what the British Expeditionary Force was doing. The Canadian Corps was part of this larger Imperial Army. So what they had to do was ensure that these regulations got down to the lowest level, because soldiers at the front often wanted to see their friends properly buried, but they might not do all these procedures such as collecting the personal effects, recording where they were buried. So it was important to overcome the individual process of mourning a loss of a friend, a colleague, with the larger needs to ensure that proper identification, registration is done, and the personal effects get back home. So what we see is within the Canadian Corps, structures and individuals assigned for this type of thing. The first Canadian Controlled Cemetery is raised in 1915. A portion of the Canadian Corps staff is assigned responsibility for this. We have a Corps registration officer who lays out the plots. and issues instructions as to where the remains will be taken. There are grave registration units that are created as well, and typically soldiers come up with nicknames for the individuals involved, such as the Corps burial officer. He didn't do the burials himself, but oversaw them, was known as the body snatcher or the cold meat specialist. And labor units assigned to dig graves and so forth, crosses constructed and so forth. So the two images here are of individuals who are responsible for the erection of the crosses and also the registration of the graves. And so we see this process evolve by the summer of 1917. For example, in the 2nd Canadian Division, very elaborate orders are issued outlining where the divisional burial officer will be located, where a forward cemetery has been assigned, that graves have already been prepared at certain locations, and various other regulations related to the collection of remains, their transport, their burial, and so forth, and ensuring that either units send out burial parties, or if they can't, to get word up to brigade, for example, or from brigade to division to ensure that individuals are assigned to do this. This is a morale issue, it's realized. Soldiers don't want to see the remains of other soldiers on the field. They want their dead friends to be properly buried. So this is a very important process that occurs at this time. There's also a very short outline of service that occurs, all right? This is in the Field Service Pocketbook of 1914. This is a 4-page document which outlines the burial of the dead in the field. And there's also provisions. The CEF and the BEF are largely Protestant, but there's also Roman Catholics, Jews, and other denominations within that. So instructions of how to deal with people of other faiths. And often a chaplain becomes involved, or if not, an officer, or sometimes a senior NCO. And they emphasize, for example, as this British Reverend said, that nothing is more depressing to the living to see unburied dead about them. Okay, and so he mentions at Beaumont Hamel that the unburied dead remained there for a while, and it became a matter of real military importance that the work of the burial should be conducted. So this, by 1916, 1917, this is an exceptionally important process. Following the war, we see the Imperial War Graves Commission, which had been founded in 1917, really begins its work. And this is created, it's a multinational imperial organization with Britain, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, India, and South Africa, basically to create cemeteries and memorials where the war dead will be collected and properly buried. All right, so for example, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission is responsible for about 2,500 cemeteries and memorials from both world wars. Of course, in 1919, they didn't know there'd be another world war, but all these cemeteries fall under their jurisdiction. The member countries provide funds for the maintenance of the graves, the production of materials about the buried and so forth. So after the Second World War, there's nearly 2 million Commonwealth soldiers, sailors, and airmen buried at their sites. And they also have responsibility for a large number of non-Commonwealth, such as Poles and other nationals, and many non-military graves as well related to the war. So, for example, with the Royal Canadian Regiment, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission sites have about 1,300 Royal Canadians buried from Bermuda from the First World War through Northwest Europe, Italy, and even Hong Kong. A member of the regiment was there in 1941. And the photograph shows one of these cemeteries. You can see how well they're laid out. It is an incredible sight to see all these crosses and to read the inscriptions on some of the stones. So this is the Moro River War Cemetery in Italy, where the 1st Canadian Division fought in 1943. And as part of the larger Allied offensive, there's about 1,700 Commonwealth burials in 16 plots in that area. there are 127 soldiers from the Royal Canadian Regiment at the Moral River War Cemetery alone. Following the First World War as well, because of the significant loss that was felt in many countries, we see in the Commonwealth that a day of remembrance is put aside, largely because for most people, there's no gravesite to go to. The graves are in Europe, the Middle East, or elsewhere, and getting over to visit them is difficult at this time. So people need somewhere where they can mourn, they can reflect, and remember the suffering of that war. So what we see is Armistice Day is created in 1923, which was the Monday closest to the 11th of November, which at the time was Thanksgiving. And in 1931, the name of that day is changed to Remembrance Day. It's moved to the 11th of November to coincide with the end of the First World War. And we also see the establishment of the 2 minutes of silence as well. Eventually, the poppies are worn as well as a symbol of the war dead based upon the poem in Flanders Fields. We see other elements of commemoration occur. For example, in 1919, a memorial cross is created for the mothers of soldiers, sailors, and Air Force personnel who die in the war. It has inscription of the name of the individual lost, and it's a silver cross that's worn on the clothing of the mother. We also see the process of the Silver Cross Mother established in 1936. That is at Remembrance Day, either at the National War Memorial and other locations. A recipient of the Memorial Cross lays a wreath on behalf of all those families who lost somebody in the war. What we see eventually is that Silver Cross is extended to all members of the family, so it's not just the mother, it's all loved ones, and changing structures of families and so forth. It's modernized. And we see this whole process undergo a rebirth in the 1990s, along with many other memorial processes. The Second World War is the conduct of burials is similar to the First World War, but there's changes in that it's much more structured. There are more units that are created. The casualties are fewer, but they're still large in number. So we see within 1st Canadian Army, the RCAF overseas, and the Royal Canadian Navy, registration organizations, cemetery construction units, concentration units, that is where the remains are collected and so forth. We see regulations about the general size of a grave, how far apart they should be. We have an example there of the identity discs. So one of them would remain with the body. The other would be collected for records processing. We see the construction of crosses with the individual's name. So now individual soldiers are commemorated with their own graves. So think back to drummer Hodge. And then we have registration officers and personnel who ensure that the location, the names, and so forth are recorded. So, for example, we have 4 Canadian War Graves Registration Unit, which has records. It has, all these units have their own war diaries. That is a daily record of what they did, also appended with other documentation. So this is from December 1944, which talks about sections going out to collect remains, to identify Canadian soldiers, also dealing with Allied soldiers. So a Polish division was under 1st Canadian Army, so they also dealt with registration of Poles who were killed. Ensuring that the crosses were placed there, replacing any that were broken or damaged or stolen, registration of graves, and all kinds of other activities. So this is a process that's going on wherever Canadian troops are. And if there are Canadians serving in a location, but not in a specific Canadian unit, then there are British or other Commonwealth organizations that are doing that as well. So by 1945, we have well-established procedures on how the remains are collected, their burial, the collection of the personal effects, the transfer of those to families, along with the process of notification of death. Generally, a telegram occurs. Sometimes there might be a letter from a commanding officer, a fellow soldier, or so forth. but that's not always the case. But at least it's a more humane procedure to ensure that families know what happened to their loved ones. It's a slightly different process during the Korean War. This is a UN mandated conflict, but it's largely American led. So the Canadians that fought there, although they were part of a Commonwealth division, they were under American command and an American field army. There was a small RCAF contingent, and 8 Canadian destroyers served there as well. But I'll focus on the Canadian Brigade group that went there, that had 3 infantry battalions, an armored squadron, artillery, and other supporting elements. There were 4 major rotations of units during the conflict, and about 516 Canadians were killed. So the United Nations establishes a memorial cemetery at Busan, just near the 38th parallel in Korea. The construction of this begins in 1951, so the remains, although they may have been temporarily buried near the front line, eventually they're transported to this location and put in a grave. There we see a soldier from the Royal 22nd Regiment kneeling by the cross of one of his colleagues. In the early stages, eventually more permanent markers, such as the one we see in the lower photo, are established. So this is a UN controlled cemetery. It's not part of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. And there's about 2,300 graves here, of which there's about 376 Canadians buried there. So you can see the discrepancy in the numbers. The difference is partly made up by soldiers being buried elsewhere, or the fact that there were no remains whatsoever to be interred. What we see by the 1960s is, because there's no major conflict, casualties begin to fall off, and they're largely the result of UN operations now. So instead of Canadians being overseas as part of a larger Commonwealth contingent, we see from Korea, and especially after Korea, Canadian units being sent overseas as part of United Nations operations. And one of the major operations from 1964 until about 1992 is the United Nations force in Cyprus, an island in the Eastern Mediterranean, which is divided between Turkish and Greek Cypriot communities, and a large peacekeeping force is instilled there. This is the period of classic peacekeeping, but there's still casualties. So for example, in the Royal Canadian Regiment, between 1967 and 1975, there's about 5 soldiers who are lost, either through accidents, sometimes actions of one of the contingents in the area, either Greek or Turkish Cypriot, such as Captain Patton, who's accidentally shot in a firefight between those 2 forces and so forth. But most of them, or at least the initial lot, were buried in Cyprus itself. There were 2 British sovereign areas, and the remains, for example, of Corporal Redmond remained in Cyprus. What we see after 1970 is the remains come to Canada, and I'll explain why that occurred. In 1969, the Royal Canadian Navy sent 2 of its ships for exercises that were based from the United Kingdom. So they went across the Atlantic. They were working with NATO forces. And after spending some time in the UK, they moved back into the Atlantic. And on one of the destroyers, HMCS Kootenay, there was an explosion that occurred that resulted in 9 sailors being killed and 53 wounded. The ship proceeded back to Plymouth in England. It was the closest port it could find, along with the other Canadian ship that was alongside it. And this is where the process of commemorating those who died begins. And the existing policy, that is of burying soldiers, sailors, or air personnel in the area where they fell, continued, which meant that the families were offered the option that the remains of their loved ones could either be buried at sea in the traditional naval method, or buried at Brookwood Military Cemetery in England, which already had a large number of Canadians buried there. The families were also told that due to financial restrictions, Only 2 members of each family were allowed to attend the funerals in England. So even though there's a large memorial service that's held at St. Nicholas Church in England, the families were quite upset about this policy. It started a controversy which made it into the public's eye about the fact that Canadian military personnel, if they died overseas, would remain there, and that there were limitations on families. So if a spouse and maybe a child went, what about the parents? They were not allowed to go. So the controversy that resulted from this caused Parliament to change the regulations in Canada. And from this point forward, beginning in 1970, any operational losses overseas would be repatriated back to Canada. So as the widow of one of the leading seamen who died, she was told only in her particular case, she and only one other person could go. She was shocked that her husband's parents couldn't go. So it's that type of outcry that led to the changes. Of the 9 who were killed, 5 were buried at sea and 4 were buried at Brookwood Cemetery. In 1974, we see an upswing in the number of casualties that occur overseas. We generally view this period as being one of classic peacekeeping, that there's very few threats to military personnel serving in them. But from time to time, there are crises that occur on the missions that they're involved in. The Middle East in particular is undergoing a very difficult process of trying to find peace. So in 1974, 12 personnel serving with the United Nations Emergency Force in the Middle East are killed, and 3 personnel serving in Cyprus are killed as well. So that's 15 that year, which is almost on the level with what we would later see in Afghanistan. In August 1974, there's a very tragic event that occurs. A Caribou aircraft of the Air Force is transporting 9 personnel from Beirut to Damascus in Syria. As it goes over Syrian airspace, a number of ground-to-air missiles are fired at it. The aircraft explodes and crashes on the ground, and everybody's killed, including Master Warrant Officer Cyril Koryevo, who had joined the Royal Canadian Regiment in 1954. So even though the remains were brought back to Canada, this whole process of how do we go about doing this hadn't yet been developed. Furthermore, given the difficulty of the peace process in the Middle East, Canada played down the fact that these military personnel had been killed, so they didn't want any major ceremony during the repatriation. So the remains were flown back to Trenton, but as one aviator stationed there recalled, I was in Trenton working the night that they brought the bodies home. Nobody was informed that they were returning until the aircraft was 30 minutes out. The warrant officer on shift had to rush around and try to find enough personnel with full uniforms, the proper uniforms, to meet the remains, so as to act as a proper guard of honor. We had to check out the mess and drag people from their barracks. So nobody was notified that the remains were coming back. There was no ramp ceremony like we know today. The personnel on the ground at Trenton quickly put together a guard, and they paid respect to the remains of the individuals who came back, which were then sent to different locations and then buried wherever their families indicated. So even though we're repatriating remains, there's still uncertainty as to what that means in terms of commemoration within Canada. We see this entire process beginning to change once Canada joins the UN and eventually NATO forces in the Balkans between 1991 and 2004. So that period of what is known as classic peacekeeping begins to disintegrate in the Balkans, where actually traditional style UN forces are incapable of operating because they're still in an exceptionally hostile environment. There is no peace to keep because the factions are still fighting. Back in Canada, Veterans Affairs is more concerned with the remaining First and Second World War veterans and those from Korea to be concerned with new casualties. So the various missions that serve in Croatia, Bosnia, Kosovo, and Macedonia incur a number of casualties between 1992 and 1995, about 23, either from action between the forces that are in place or accidents that occur on the ground. So what happens over time with the number of wounded that come back that need help from Veterans Affairs and the number of dead coming back that have to be properly cared for and buried, significant pressure is placed on not only the military, but the government of how to deal with these casualties. So we begin to see the revitalization of Veterans Affairs, processes put in place for notification of casualties. So rather than a telegram, somebody in uniform will arrive at the family's residence and inform them as to what happened and help them through the process of repatriation and the burial of their family and any other aspects dealing with benefits and so forth. So for example, we see in the case of Sergeant Ralph, one of the first Canadian soldiers killed in the Balkans, this process begins and it evolves over time. But it's really in Afghanistan that we see the fruition to the modern process. So this lengthy war that Canada becomes involved in the beginning that sees casualties on a level not experienced since Korea. 158 CF personnel were killed up until 2011. 27 of them were from the Royal Canadian Regiment. This included the first Canadian woman soldier to die in action, Captain Nicola Goddard, who was killed in May 2006. We see certain periods where there's 6 or 9 casualties within a certain day. So we have the ramp ceremony that's conducted back in Afghanistan, where a party takes the coffin onto an aircraft, and then the repatriation ceremony in Trenton, often with the Governor General, the Prime Minister, Minister of National Defense, senior military commanders present, and the families who are accompanied by an assisting officer who helps them through this process. As the remains are conveyed for Trenton to Toronto, where the coroner for the Canadian Forces will do the final autopsy before the body is released, we see the motorcades bringing the remains to Toronto transform the 401 into the Highway of Heroes. And on the bridges crossing the 401, we see people often collecting, firefighters and other people in uniform, to pay tribute to the personnel who are lost. The family support that's provided is increased dramatically. Casualty identification programs are established and so forth. A designated assistant is assigned to families to help them through the process. They receive training in how to do this and understanding of the regulations, who to contact for assistance. They get what is called a toolkit with all the information they need. There's various volunteer programs that occur, such as helping our peers by providing empathy or hope. 8-wing forms of pipes and drums, and a special unit which is used for the repatriation ceremonies. So we see a significant change occurring in the way this occurs. And most recently in April 2020, Cyclone helicopter operating in the Mediterranean, in the Ionian Sea during Operation Reassurance crashes as approaching a Canadian frigate. The 6 crew and passengers that were on board the aircraft all die. It takes some time to collect all the remains, but that May, there's a major repatriation ceremony at 8-wing in Trenton, and this is where we see the remains brought back and honors paid at a national level to these casualties from the Canadian Forces. So that is a general overview of this entire process, who really, out of basically a century, transformed dramatically from basically burying the remains of soldiers as quickly as possible, not necessarily marking them or recording them, to a very regimented process of ensuring that they're properly buried either in theater, that their personnel effects are collected, that where they are buried is recorded, and eventually the remains are moved to a Commonwealth War Graves Commission or another site such as that controlled by the UN in Korea, and eventually repatriated back to Canada after 1970 and the support provided to families. There's significant resources available online and in print if you're interested in researching this. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission has a magnificent website with its graves registers that have considerable information about the remains that are buried at their sites. The Canadian Virtual War Memorial as well, just Google the names of these organizations, has significant information. Often the details of the individual soldier, sailor, or Air Force personnel include photographs, newspaper clippings, and other information that have been collected. Library and Archives Canada offers opportunities for, at least up until the First World War and Second World War, to obtain copies of service records of individuals, an opportunity to study the death cards that list where they're buried, any other notations that were done. Unit war diaries are available that can provide information. And overseas, such as the UK National Archives in London, you can get the operational record books, many of which are available online, but also service records as well for British and some Commonwealth personnel, and the war diaries for other units as well. So that's the overview that I shared with you today. I hope you found this interesting and informative, and thank you very much for your attention, and you have a good day.
Thank you, Dr. Grodzinsky. A very informative and instructive presentation, very timely also as we are approaching the Remembrance season. Thank you all for following us, and hopefully you'll tune in for the last episode of the season scheduled on 18 November 2021. We will meet then Ellen Bessner, who researched an extraordinary story from the Second World War that happened in December 1943. Stirling Castle, the story behind RCR Lieutenant Mitch Stirling's gallantry in Italy in World War II.